G'day. In this video, what we're actually going to be looking at is basically going through a couple of different bits and pieces, creating this random score generator. I've got a quick screen grab of what you'll need to do. So it's a layout diagram with a little bit of laziness thrown in. And the main thing is what this program is going to do is it's two simple text boxes, and they could have been labels or anything else really, and a grade it button. So the very first thing I'm going to do is explain how this program works. So it's going to generate a random score between 1 and 100, and it's going to do that with variables, so nothing's going to appear on the form yet. And a variable just means it's going to hold on to that information straight up. The second one is it's going to place that variable, and I've called it score, into text box 1. So placing that number into there. The second thing it's going to do is it's going to look at that value of score and find out what letter does it deserve. So it's really going to be a single type of branching system to try and figure out, or decision-making process to really try and get that understanding of if statements, random numbers, which will be a little bit tricky for some that haven't worked with them before, and also just to see how it does actually come together and how to make a project complete. So without further ado, we'll jump to Visual Basic, or sorry, my bad, Visual Studio in the Visual Basic form, which I've quickly created already. The only functions you'll actually need in your toolbox is a button, which you'll see highlighted there, as well as a text box, and nothing special about that, just a general text box will be fine. So one of the main things is the text box 1 that I've actually had on my layout diagram. I've actually given it a reasonable name, txt_score, because it's going to display my actual raw score. The second text box is being called txt_letter grade because it's going to display that letter grade for me. And finally, the button press, or the button rather, is called btn_grade. Again, naming things is crucial. So one of the main things that I noticed everybody kind of does is when they get a little project like this, is they try and do everything all at once, and that's a big no-no. If you try and do everything at once, you're either going to come up with errors, you're going to get stuck, you're going to get disheartened, or straight out confused, not knowing where to go through. You could strike it lucky and get the project working flawlessly, but in this learning stage you really want to focus on getting one little bit at a time. So one thing that we want to look at is, one of the things it does is it places a score in the text box. Let's actually just get that text box 1 to be displaying something. So let's get txt_ to display something when I press the button. So the very first thing I want to do is actually pick the object that I'm trying to change. So I've double clicked on the button, which means it's going to be in the button_grade_click event. So when I click this button, and what do I want to change? Well, this is my text box called txt_score, and I want to change what's written there. At the moment, nothing's written there. So let's try and scan through the properties and find the one that we need to change. And I'll help you out here. It is actually text. So if I came in and wrote the word hello, it pops up. Now, obviously I don't want the word hello, so I could actually have the number 22, and that would be the score. It's a number between 1 and 100 or something like that. At this stage, I'm not too worried about having something in there, but it does show me that the property I want to grab is text. So jumping back to my code, I'm going to select the name of the object, which was txt_score. That's that name of the text box I want to change. The part of that I want to change, mind me, the part of that I want to change is actually text. So you can hit tab to select that, or you can handwrite it. Now currently it's errored out, that's fine. And if you look at your error list, it must assign a property to its value. It doesn't know what to do with it yet. That's because we haven't finished coding. So always make sure you finish a line of code before you get worried about that it's not working or it's all red. So I want this object of this property, or this property on this object rather, to equal, and let's just give a random score. Let's say 22. Let's stick with that. In actual better fact, let's use a reference, 42. So again, this is just Visual Basic code, and all I've written is I've said the object, that txt score, dot text, which is the property I want to access, and then I've set it to say 42. So if I was to do that manually, I'd select the object, txt underscore score, scroll down to text, and type in the number 42. That's what I want to happen. But I want that to happen during runtime, so whilst the program is running. So let's hit start and see what happens. So you'll see my random grader is here. I'm going to hit grade it, and the only thing that should happen is I should get a number 42 there. And it worked. I could delete that or make it 2, and every single time it's going to work. Even if I had the word hello, it should always replace it with that number. So currently I've got the first part working already. I now have places this score in text box 1. Well, I don't have it as a score, but I do have things working to be placed in text box 1. I've got that part worked out. I know how to change a text box. From here, generates a random score between 1 to 100. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this, and it depends on what platform you're building for. So if you're trying to build for, let's say, the Windows Phone environment, some code does work, some code doesn't. It depends on what you're using. So let's try and get something to randomize. So let's leave this one here, but I'm going to comment this one here and say sets a default value 42 to the text box. It just tells me what it's actually doing. The next thing I want to do is I want to actually randomize a number. So let's play with randomization. So I could actually come through and write in randomize. And what this randomize does is it actually will initialize if I can spell properly, initialize the random function. And that random function specifically is RND. So if I forgot to include this, I'll get a few errors or some things won't work. It basically allows it to start working. We won't go too far in depth with that one just yet. The next thing I want to do is I want to actually get a random number. So for this, I'm going to basically create a message box. Now there's other ways to do it. I always like my message boxes because they just are much more easier to work with. And always a hello world one usually makes sure that that message is working. So again, break it into small parts. So I hit start, grade it. I get a message that says hello world, which is what I was after. So it displays the message and then it displays that. Now, I don't want it to display hello world at all. I want it to display that random number. So I'm going to come in and write random, open it up, and basically type in, oh, well, I don't need a number at all for that because it's actually going to give me a number between 0 and 1. So again, let's hit start. 0.14. Okay, and every time I hit the button, it is going to be a different number. Okay. The problem is you'll notice that it only went from 0 to 1. If I want to actually change that, I need to multiply that random number by 6. And what that, oh, not 6, sorry, by 100. And what that's actually going to do is that's going to multiply it by 100, which will give that component all the way up to that higher number that I want, that higher range. So I'm going to hit save, and constantly save, it's always good. Hit grade, 82.34, 85.31, 23.8. So you can actually see that the numbers are all over the place in that regard. Now, it's giving me a bit more range, and I could sit here and test it for a little bit longer, but it's actually not going to work entirely, and that's the way the whole system works. You've got to get in with +1s and stuff. I'm not going to worry about the specifics. That's a challenge for you to put aside to make sure you get the full range of numbers. The best trick to learn, or a smaller one, would be use dice rolls. Use ×6 and see what I'm explaining, just by a couple of trial and error to see what appears. So I now have a command that's going to give me a random number, but it doesn't need to appear in this message box at all. That wasn't part of the design brief. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to comment that out because it's still working code, but it's not really useful just yet. So from here I'm going to go displays a message with a random number. I'm basically keeping parts of my code for the moment until I get the next part working. So I've got a message box that displays a random number, and this is the core, this is the brains behind that random number. So I'm simply going to copy that and replace it with my 42. Sets a default value of 42, well, and I realized I just spelt that wrong. I'm going to change that to sets a random value to the text box. I'm going to save and play. Let's see what happens. Well, 99.6, 5.2, 13.6, 15, 69, 11.5, 83.3. You get the idea, and obviously I'm not rounding properly. But that's a bit of a problem. They're showing me decimal numbers. For a score, I don't want decimals. Let's just say you could only get 1 point for each question. No half marks. Well, that means I need to actually use a bit of a special trick, and I need to wrap that random in an integer brackets. And what that's going to do is, if you remember, an integer is a whole number, and it's going to return the integer portion of the number. It's going to ignore the decimals completely. If you wanted it to round, you've got to get a little bit more technical, but this will actually give me the integer portion of the number. And I've placed that in brackets, and you can see those brackets line up there. Save and play. And now I've got my random number generator working. You'll see that I've now got generates a random number score between 1 and 100. Again, I've got a little bit of a side part missing, but that's a challenge for you. Then you've got places this score in text box 1. Places the score in text box 1. I'm now 50% done. I haven't tried to do everything all at once. I've broken it up into small bits. The next thing that we've got is checks value of score, then assigns it a letter grade in text box 2. So remember, I did say that we wanted to try and keep this pretty simple. So let's simplify our code starting. Let's do a bit of a cleanup. We no longer need that. We've got this core, this brains in our working code, so I can delete that random or that temporary comment. And I actually now want to go through it and start my next part. I want it to look at that score value and set it into the text box, but there's something that I missed, and I've just realized it then. It says generates a random score between 1 and 100 and then places the score in text box 1. Now, what I could have done is I could have actually grabbed a variable and stored it in a temporary variable to hold that information. It will be a lot more efficient to actually do that. However, we're going to keep on going through and we'll replace that at the end. So I'm trying to avoid the variable at the moment. So what I want it to do, so let's try and get some brainstorming. Well, I want, once the number's been generated, I want to check what that number is, and if it's, let's say, more than 50, that's going to turn into the word pass, or P for pass. If it's less than 50, I want it to turn into a fail. So here, check to see if what grade should be given. So it's actually going to go through, and I apologize for the keyboard strokes, the joys of a mechanical keyboard. So check to see what grade should be given. So we're going to start this off with an if statement, and an if statement works with a very simple premise. You start with if, then you have a condition, and then you continue with then. So if the condition is true, and I know there's errors all over the place, but if the thing that I put in here is true, then it will run the next bit of code. If it's not true, then it skips it. So I'll give you an example. If that text underscore score dot text, so that value of that text box that has that number that we just generated it in, is greater or equal to, let's say, 50, then we've got to do a couple of things. So the very first one is it's if must end with a matching end if. So I could come along and actually write message box whatever. Obviously that's going to go through. That's a single line if statement. I would recommend you get in the habit of going through and placing that at the bottom, and it obviously will come up with an end if automatically if you're using Visual Studio Community, and it will go through and run all the code inside that block if statement. But we don't want it to be a message box. Well, what do we want to happen? Well, if it's greater than 50, we want it to set the text box to pass. So how do we do that? Well, txt underscore letter grade, which again, just as a reminder, is this text box. Dot text, again, that's the property what you want to change, just like the number in the previous example. Dot text is equal to pass. So let's see what happens. Always again, save every time. So what should happen? It initializes the randomized function, then it runs the random component and sets that value in my first text box, which you'll see here, and then it checks to see what that value is, and if it's greater than 50, this will say pass. So let's try it. 69, pass. Okay, I'll just restart that project. 78, pass. I'll restart it and hope I don't crash my computer. Grade it. 93, pass. The problem with this is every time I pass it, even though it says 12, it didn't clear that word pass. So we've got to have something called an else statement. So I'm going to come in and place the word else. If it's not greater than 50, then that must mean it's less than 50. So I'm going to go and say that txt underscore letter grade dot text would equal fail, which means set the text box to fail. So let's see how this goes. It means I won't have to restart the project as much as well. So again, nothing has changed above. I've only added a little bit more. It's going to ask if the score is greater or equal to 50, and if it is, it's going to display the second text box on the right to say pass. If it's not greater than 50, it means it's less than 50, so it's going to do that section for us. So 11 is a fail, 17 is a fail, 54 is a pass, 25 is a fail, and all of a sudden you get this working combination of everything nice. Now, here's a bit of a trick. Remember that little challenge I gave you before? And I said it should have a +1? That's because we've now got 0. We shouldn't end up with 0. So we've got to come in and change something to this, and it's as simple as adding a +1. Again, the challenge stays with you to get that working, but that's what I was discussing now that it coincidentally came up. So one of the main things that I'm going to do is let's start to break it down into a little bit better. So let's give it some specific letters. So if it's above 80, I want it to give it a score of A, or a letter grade A. Otherwise, I want it to say fail. So let's hit save, let's hit play, let's generate some numbers. 89, it's an A. 36 is a fail. Well, that makes sense. 82 is an A. 48, fail. 71, now that's 70%, but it's still marked as a fail. That doesn't work quite well. We obviously haven't finished off our thought process here, so let's continue with that. From here, we've got our else. But if it's, what happens if it's between 60 and 80? Well, let's give it another grade. And we can do that by asking a second question. Else if. Now, we have been through these before, so if you do get a bit confused about it, please come up and ask. But we can go up and say greater to equal to 60. And all of a sudden we have this second block. So what this question actually does is this whole line going along here is else if text score.text is greater or equal to 60, then it's going to run the code here. And again, that means it's text underscore letter grade dot text is equal to, well, let's say between 60 and 80% is a B, for argument's sake. Now, one of the main things that you'll notice is I am commenting a lot of my code, and it really does help to have proper, well done comments. Obviously, probably shouldn't go too specific, otherwise they don't mean just as much as the code does, but it really helps to go through and find things out. But the way that an else if statement works, and the reason why it's different to an if statement, is it's actually part of that first if statement. And the logic works like this. If this is true, then it will run this bit of code and only this bit of code. Once it's finished, it jumps to the bottom of the end if statement and then would continue, which means it skips all this. If the score was not greater than 80, then instead of just running something else randomly, it then asks the next question. So is the score greater than 60? Now, if you've already checked it, it's not greater than 80, it must mean that it's less than 80. So that's actually checking, realistically, it's between 60 and 80. That's a bit confusing, but try and type it up, change numbers, see how you go, and it starts to build that logic process just with playing around with numbers and values. So if this was not greater or equal to 80, then it asked this question. And if it was greater or equal to 60, then it would actually run this code and then jump to the bottom. But if both of these if statements were false, then it jumps into the else statement and runs the last part. So let's check that, make sure it's actually working. Start, grade it, 9 is a fail. Well, that's less than 80, yes. It's less than 60, which means it has to be a fail. 10, bad example. 76. So 76 is less than 80, so I'm going to ask the next question. Is it greater than or equal to 60? Well, 76 is greater or equal to 60, so I'm going to set it as B. 52. So it's not greater or equal to 80. It's not greater or equal to 60, so it's going to run the last part. Now, obviously from here, you can get very lazy and just do a bit of copy-paste of your own code. And obviously you can just see the pattern that I'm actually going with this here. Between 40 and 60 is going to be a C. And again, 20, that can be a D. So if you've got 20%, so I'm being very generous with my scores. And otherwise, instead of this word fail, I'm not a big fan of fail. I'm just going to set it as an E. So very, very simple, copy-pasted the same thing, because I checked that the first part worked. And I'm confident that this code will work. Might not, but we'll try it. So, 87, well, that's greater than 80. 38, so it's not greater than 80, not greater than 60, not greater than 40, but it is greater than 20, which means it's going to run this bit of code, which is a D, and we did get a D. 82, A. So you can actually see that little program does work. Now, I will try and include some C# variations of the same thing, but there is other ways to do every single thing. So let's look at just randomizing the number. That was the function that I've used for years. Let's actually jump into Google, write VB random number, and literally hold down Control and open a couple of tabs, whole heap of different searches, and we can actually see that there's a whole heap of different variations. And this is obviously the one that I've used in a slight variation of it, which is fine. And you could read through this whole lot. I'm trying to speed through this though. That's that same randomize function that I've used. There's another one, random number generator and random integer. So as we're going through all the different examples, you will find some that are different. Bad example for it, because the examples that I'm bringing up are almost the same. There's a little bit more complicated ones that they're bringing out of people writing their own random number generators, but it looks like the most common way to randomize a number for VB is that. So I thank Google and the internet for confirming that what I had was correct. So that is the end of this project build. If you do have any more troubles with it, please sing out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you on the other side and go from there. Cheers.